I guess the theme of what I'm meditating or reflecting on is life and death. There's kind of an echo. Is that my fault or somebody? Maybe if people could mute who aren't speaking. Um, yeah. Anyways, it's kind of a meditation on life and death. Many stories from popular culture, ancient and modern, teach an important and somewhat counterintuitive lesson. Although many philosophers, psychologists, and sociologists teach that society and the human psyche are shaped by a search for immortality and a fear or terror of death, the true horror may actually be immortality. Think of the monkey's paw, in which the wish to bring someone back to life from the dead can only be transcended in its horrifying reality by using the third and final wish to return them to their grave and death. Or consider Groundhog Day and its many successors and imitators, in which the undying protagonist in the film experiences immortality as a curse that can only be overcome when the transcendent power of love and selflessness enables them to achieve the redemption of waking up to a new day and a real life of connection and of consequence. I've been writing a story cycle for a book I'm working on jointly with a Native American political prisoner called Oso Blanco. My story is about a three-way battle among humans, vampires, and zombies. Zombies, of course, are the living dead. They are accursed. Mindless, they're condemned to eat the brains of others. Vampires, too, are the undead, nearly immortal, bloodless, with no beating heart. They are condemned to drink the hot blood of living others. Vampires and zombies are a plague. Their immortality is a curse and a threat. Here are a couple of quotes from an essay by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, whom we all know as an associate of Dr. Martin Luther King. His essay was called Death as Homecoming. Heschel says, "Death is a radical refutation of man's power and a stark reminder of the necessity to relate to a meaning which lies beyond the dimension of human time. Humanity without death would be arrogance without end. Nobility has its root in humanity, and humanity derives much of its power from the thought of death. Death refutes the deification and distorts the arrogance of man." Heschel goes on to say, "The aspiration is to obtain, but the perfection is to dispense." This is the meaning of death, the ultimate self-dedication to the divine. Death, so understood, will not be distorted by the craving for immortality, for this act of giving away is reciprocity on man's part for God's gift of life. For the pious man, it is a privilege to die. Heschel taught that a Jew is asked to take a leap of action rather than a leap of thought or faith, as we sometimes call it. He's asked to do more than he understands in order to understand more than he does. The term mitzvah in Hebrew expresses doing what God wills. A mitzvah, which is more or less commandment or good deed, is a prayer in the form of a deed, Heschel says. I would say that the mitzvah is a form of sacrifice, a good deed done for its own sake, a virtue that is its own reward, sacrificing a bit of our time and of our life for others, an act of thanksgiving that only makes sense because life and time are finite for human beings. In the Christian tradition, the Book of Common Prayer has it that man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live and is full of misery. He cometh up and is cut down like a flower. He fleeth as were a shadow, and never continueth in one stay. In the midst of life we are in death. Of whom may we seek for succor, but of thee, O Lord, for whom our sins art justly for our sins art justly displeased. Death is a part of the cycle of life. Cell death is a constant of our existence from the moment of birth. And in fact, in every living cell, what life actually means is a burning, a process of consuming and transforming something organic to build some other organic thing. In the process, creating waste material that is no longer living and must be removed from the cell and ultimately from the body. The symbiotic exchange of such materials and processes is the natural order of life. It's the nature of an ecosystem in which the decay of formerly living things provides sustenance for other living things. An immortal plant or animal would be an incredibly selfish and yet ultimately a self-defeating, self-destructive being that took and never gave back. Life and death form a dialectical whole like yin and yang that interpenetrate each other. Everything that has a beginning has an end, and without death, life might actually have as little meaning as the passage of time would when the passage of time doesn't matter. The Buddha had to spend time in a charnel house watching human bodies decay back to their constituent chemicals to achieve enlightenment. Only in recognizing our own mortality, our embeddedness in the cycle of life and death, decay and rebirth, can we connect to a sense of the eternal and the infinite. The Jewish prayer said to those grieving a loss translates roughly as, "May the sacred place comfort you with or among all the other mourners of Zion." Death and loss are an inevitable part of the human experience and provide us with compassion and connection to all the other humans who inevitably suffer loss and death. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was powerful. Yeah. We'll have to sidebar. There are a couple different things that I've been, books and TV that I've been reading on and watching on that theme. So some, I'm glad I'm glad that was your subject today. We had a few other people join us. So Dr. Ruby, if you can unmute and introduce yourself.
And thank you, Michael. I knew that was going to be interesting this morning. I'm a part of the board here, just sending love. I'm with International Metaphysical Ministries. I'm with Agape. I'm with Spiritual Living with Ceasefire in LA, and just supporting all of us, nationalities, religions, everything coming together. Thank you, Father Chris, for your work on peace this morning in advance. And I pass.
Thank you. Susan Stauffer, if you can introduce yourself.
Good morning, and I echo the sentiments. Give us plenty to think about this morning, Michael, and looking forward to Father Chris's talk. And it's good to see everyone, Solo Community Peace Center and the board of ICJP.
Great. Let's see who else. Good to have you here. Lucy, thank you. If you can introduce yourself. Oh no, did you already do that? And that was iPhone?
Yeah, Lucy already introduced
herself. That's
yes. Right. Thank you. Thank you, Rick.
Oh, no worries. Jeanette Ellis Royston, if you can introduce yourself. Hello. Well, we can come back. Jasmine, if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jasmine Haley. I'm an ICJP board member and outreach committee. Happy to be here. Happy to see everybody this morning.
Great.
Thank you, Rick.
No worries. And I think we got everybody. And do we have any affiliate reports? That would be groups within ICJP or direct ICJP connection. that we need to talk about this morning or would like to make an announcement? Michael, yes.
Given that we have created a relationship with KPFK, I thought I should let people know that as of Monday, I will be the interim general manager of KPFK,
Wow.
unpaid, because unfortunately the station has zero funding. We did a search for a GM. We had a number of very credible candidates who are radio professionals, which I am not. But the executive director of Pacifica determined, and the board, Pacific National Board, voted last night that they have to make it an unpaid volunteer position. And so I'll be taking that on for some months and hopefully be able to restore the station to some form of fiscal solvency good enough to eliminate my position as an interim and get us somebody who, has the full array of professional qualifications that we'll need going forward. So I just want to let people know that, and I will be looking to people for some help with a number of things. I'm interested in trying to develop a show with an interfaith show on the air, although I'd like the participants, frankly, to be a couple of generations younger than most of us here. But if you have some ideas about that, people from, different faiths with a progressive viewpoint who could talk about the moral and ethical dimensions of current affairs and social issues. And that's one of the things I'd like to see instituted. Thank you.
Oh, that's.
I'm going to stop my video, by the way, because I learned that apparently it uses 10 times as much energy to have your camera on in terms of the bandwidth required on Zoom. So I'm here, but you won't see my face.
No, that's all right. Thank you. Good to remember. Stephen, if you can, I think you had something you wanted to say.
Yes, thank you. I have a report to give on the Jerusalem Prayer Project, which is part of ICUJP under the umbrella of ICUJP. We are having a fundraiser for a project that Robert Corsini and I have been working on now for almost 6 years, filming grassroots peacemakers in Israel and Palestine. And where it just seems that peace is so difficult to come by, intractable, it seems. But always in the grassroots, there are people who are untiringly working to build bridges across differences, and that's what we need to do. So Robert and I have been putting together this film. It's now called Warriors of the Heart. And we're having a fundraiser at my house shortly before I depart for the other coast on October 8th, in which Robert and I will be showing clips of our work in the Jerusalem Prayer Project. And you're all invited. It begins at 6:30, and we will have music, and we will have the backyard. My back garden will be set up as a theater, the big screen, and there will be music, and it will be well lit and beautiful in the evening. That's Saturday evening, October 8th, and notices will be sent out over this weekend. Thank you.
No, that's great. And by all means, we'll make sure to put it on we'll talk about where you want it on ICJP social media if you do. That's great. I think someone else had their hand up. Was it you, Jasmine? Or was that clapping?
I was just clapping for Michael's. That's great for Michael's. Yeah, it's great.
Great, thank you. A lot of people, I think, maybe came here today from the email that we send out weekly that tells you about the program and what we're doing. And we're very glad that you're able to take a look at it and be involved. Also, when you at the bottom of that email, and also at the bottom of the website, there's a donate button. And if you can take a look at that, and if you have a chance to donate to ICJP, it would be great to do that. We are working on doing a lot more things in the community and also online. We had the September 11th event, and I can actually put a link to that program on the chat for everybody that maybe didn't see it, and you can copy the link and watch it at your leisure. But we're working with a lot of different groups, and we could use the financial help in order to further what we're doing in peace and justice in Los Angeles and in the greater in the greater community as well. So I will put that link in there, and I think that's it. Was there someone that was going to introduce you, Chris? Or I think basically everybody here is familiar with you, especially as a board member. If I can, I do want to say one thing that I think Lewis Chase married my wife and I a few years ago, and he said that you were very helpful with putting together the program. So I appreciate that. We're still together, if that is any indication of how successful it was. And thank you for the opportunity to hear what you've put together.
Well, good morning again, and it's always good to be amongst this great group of folks. And I'm one of those older folks, so pre-ICJP, I was part of, with some of you and many others who have gone to the Greater Kingdom, we were part of the Interfaith Coalition Against War in the Persian Gulf, and that morphed into the Interfaith Coalition Against the War in Iraq, and that gave birth to ICJP. So there are many elders that we stand on their shoulders, as they say, and we link arms. So I'm conscious of them this morning. And this came up in the context of the board was looking for speakers, and this is the day where a year ago, artist John August Swanson died, a local artist who was also a peace activist. And some of you might not know him, but he, for many years, stood on the corner in Hollywood with peace signs before, during, and after wars on Friday night from like 5 to 7. And he was just a faithful activist. And so that kind of spurred this conversation this morning. And so I hope what I share leads to a conversation. I'm an active pastor, so I do need to drop off at 9 to do my role of being pastor with our team. So, but we're blessed also with Olga Sarabia here. Both of us were just named as ambassadors of peace for the National Pax Christi organization. So maybe Olga, if you're staying on, at that point, hopefully we'll be in question and answer and conversation. But and Michael, thank you so much for that opening. My daytime job is a chaplain at LA County USC Medical Center. So I walk through 10 to 30 people's death resurrections every week. And so what you said just resonates, the truth of how we put our lives in context. Last Sunday night, I was called to the bedside of a woman who had some water on her feet issues. So not a big issue. Her husband came to visit her, was sitting at the bedside when he began to look like he was sleeping. And then she and the nurse began to realize that he had just died while he was visiting her. So the reality of life and death that Michael spoke of is, however we see that in our own philosophy, spirituality, cosmology, it touches all of us. So, and when we talk about nonviolence, the opposite of nonviolence is violence, which often includes war or verbal abuse. And it's so what we're about as nonviolent people is how do we raise a different set of values, and then how do we put that into action? So that conversation about John August Swanson's morphed into this conversation about to include Pope Francis. And so I'm going to share a screen, hopefully. So to keep me on focus, let's see. I want to. You're probably not seeing this yet, right?
Right.
Not yet.
Okay, so we'll go here and then we'll go here.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll go there. So how many of you know of the art of John August Swanson?
I do.
Okay. This is one of John's pieces, a powerful image of protests, processions, people gathered together to be an instrument of light. And often we see this happening spontaneously in the context of war or violence or hatred. And John was born in January of 1938. Some of us were alive, some of us weren't, and died on this day a year ago after several months of struggling with cancer and also affected by COVID. He's known to work in the medium of serigraphy, which is, if you know, it's what T-shirts with graphics on it is. This piece would probably have about 182 colors. And so there's a skill that John brought to his art as well as his spirit of nonviolence. He often worked in oil, sometimes in watercolor and acrylics, mixed medium, and an etching. John was born at our hospital at LA County, USC. His parents died in our hospital, and I had the privilege of knowing him for 40 some years and being a part of his parents' funeral and his sister's funeral. I want to begin and acknowledge we as a Catholic Church have been terrible on violence and nonviolence. So I want to call out the elephant in the room. So this is that period of our church where we were the violent people. Because we had power, we told people that they had to believe like we did. And if they didn't, they would be killed and tortured. And whether it would be the Inquisition or the conquest of nations, including California and other places. So I want to acknowledge that as I talk about nonviolence from John Swanson and Francis's point of view, we have not had a good history on this. And we continue to be a church, among other churches, that need to not only apologize and confront our dark side and our violent side, but hopefully move forward as in our best practices to be disciples as Christians, of disciples of Jesus, the nonviolent one. But I just want to put that out because I'm very conscious of our history. And as ICUJP was birthed with the line, religions must not bless war, we for many centuries were the blessers of war. And so I bring those images because it reminds us of our church was also the promoter of the just war theory. And Pope Francis has led our church in the last few years to move away from the just war theory. It was birthed as a way to limit war, but it became used to justify war in many centuries of our human history. So John August Swanson, this is what he looked like. He was a very humble, wonderful man. If you ever got to know him, if you were in his presence for more than 5 or 10 minutes, he would hand you his pieces of art for free. He just was always promoting beauty and his art too. This image on the right is an image he did many years ago called A Time to Heal. And he graciously allowed that to be the logo here at St. Camillus. As you can see, several patients, and then someone caring for them, holding their hand, playing music, and nurses taking care of patients. If you ever were in the old LA County General Hospital, this looked like one of the rooms. There would be often 6 or 12 patients in a room. 10 years ago, we opened the new hospital, and it's much more private now for infection control. But that image speaks to us. And John, over the years, took his art, and like this particular piece of a poster, he would turn it into something that was prophetic and social justice minded. So this one says, health is not a consumer good, but a universal right. Access to health services cannot be a privilege. So John always took his art, whatever format it was, and turned it into a place of his activism as a peace person. John was influenced by a religious sister by the name of Corita Kent. Many of you probably know her because of her stamp that became part of the US postage system on love. She had many pieces of work. She was doing art and teaching in the 60s and 70s and influenced John greatly. She once said this quote, "Creative ability is often," and let's see, my screen is covering. I can't see the quote. Okay. Creative ability is often mistakenly attributed to inborn talent. It is about all the ability to create one thing with another. And if you don't know her history, I encourage you to Google up and find out more about Corita Kent. She was clearly part of the Catholic movement of Vatican II to let go of our painful history of violence. And she did that in her art too. This is one of John's early pieces. And it's on our wall here at St. Camillus. And this was he would start with these kind of basic images of people doing work. He was very much a strong promoter of labor, of unions, of working together. And so this is just a day in the life of people going to work, going to the store, interacting with people, all in the image of working together. This is another early piece of John. I hope you can see it. I'll try to explain it a little bit. So he began with this man reading the newspaper, and it talks about a war happening and that there was people being pulled together and drafted for the war. And the next image is a warrior along with a scientist. And then in John's twist of things, here is this scientist creating some chemical, and he puts the chemical on a factory, and the factory turns it into what looks like a bomb. And this bomb is put into the cannon, but what he put in the bomb was peace. And so when the cannon blows up, it's doves and colors and people and humanity. So even though this kind of looks like a pro-war cartoon, for John, it was a pro-peace to get people to think about this and then to be challenged by, oh, cannons aren't to blow people up, it's to bring peace. This is a more recent piece of John, bright colors. He was born with a father from Sweden, a mother from Mexico. His father taught him the art of silk screening. His mother gave him the culture of Mexico, and then he was greatly influenced by the war in El Salvador. And so the colors become the bright colors of the art of El Salvador. This is one of his interfaith pieces. And if you go to johnaugustswanson.org, his gallery is available. And he does have a gallery in San Diego as well as in Pasadena. This is a poem that is from the Turkish Muslim community. When I stand, I pray with the trees that stand upright in the forest, praising God with them. When I bend, I pray with the animals that walk on all fours, praising God with them. When I lie prostrate, I pray with the grass and the flowers and the insects of the earth, praising God with them. I praise God for all creation. Allah Akham, God is great. So John took various current issues and put it into the context of art. John also is famous for cartoons and images of clowns. This is one of his pieces of clowns in a circus. And if you're familiar with the writings of Edward Hayes, especially his book called Holy Fools, if you've never read that, it's a wonderful piece, but that theology is what John does in some of his art. He draws pictures and images of clowns, of everyday life, so as for us to self-reflect on these images. But it's always about drawing us into peacemaking. This is a wonderful piece that he did, which is an orchestra, obviously, with brilliant colors and all the various instruments. And he quotes at the top Leonard Bernstein, "This will be our reply to violence, to make music more intensely, more beautifully, more devoutly than ever before." And then he quoted on the bottom, Pope Francis, "Everyone has a contribution to offer to the whole of society. Everyone has a trait that can be useful in living together. No one is excluded from contributing something for the good of all." And that's clearly where Pope Francis and John met over the years of how do we bring people in from all the diversities of life. Once again, this is another early piece of John that he eventually turned into a color print. You can really change the world if you care enough, from Marion Wright Elton. So John tried to incorporate his love of color, of love of story making into his works of art. He closes on the bottom there with Martin Luther King. "Today, our very survival depends on our ability to stay awake, to adjust to new ideas, to remain vigilant, and to face the challenge of change." And as I mentioned, he was affected by Corita Kent, and she was an artist of the 60s and the anti-war world. And she very much used a lot of lettering and used lettering graphics to depict images of nonviolence. And this is a poster that John put together that brought together people of peacemaking and words of peacemaking. He honored people from the humanist world, the religious world, especially the world of anti-war Vietnam period of time. And then that morphed into his work against the war in El Salvador. There are several galleries in Southern California around graphics of nonviolence and peacemaking. And and John, his art, and Sister Karita Kent, their art was a part of that. This is another example of taking images that were in the news and turning that into a poster with words about justice. These are two other pieces of John. One on the left there is a clown, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm sorry, when I made the copy, it's not as crystal clear as his. His is very precise in his colors. But John also became known for his art about biblical texts, both Hebrew texts and Christian texts and Muslim texts. This is an image of Lazarus in the Christian text and Jesus embracing him and bringing back to life. But John's piece is always about sub-stories. And so behind that are these other people gathered together, his two sisters grieving, the community coming together, assuming that they were having a funeral. And in this Christian story, Jesus brings Lazarus back to life. But it's all about storytelling from John Swanson's perspective. This does more justice to his colors. And we have about 14 originals of John Swanson in our church. So you're always welcome to come in and see some of his art. Cal Lutheran in Thousand Oaks has even a greater collection of John's art. His art is in the Smithsonian Institute in DC and in galleries around the world. So this was leading up to our conversation about Pope Francis. This is one of John's pieces about bringing song and hope into the midst of a world full of war. So he quotes Pope Francis, never again war, never again the clash of arms, never again so much suffering. May peace come to our time and to our world. So, and if you look at John's piece here, once again, there's the main story in front. But then if you look in the windows of the buildings above, there's a story in each of those windows. John would take anywhere from 6 to 9 months to make these pieces of art. And because of the density of the art, he would take about 6 to 8 months after that to come back to humanity. The intensity of the art drove him into a deep place of bright and hope, but also darkness. And I'm sure other artists on this know how that can happen. But if you look in this art, so there's a bakery, there's a woman that's sewing clothes, there's a family, looks like they're looking up in prayer. There's a market. He was very much part of all the markets in the Hollywood and West LA and LA, always supporting local farmers. But this is one of his depictions. John was a musician and would play the violin, and he would commonly joke.
Right. Tony, you want me to do it through my earphones, or you want to listen?
I'm sorry?
Can everybody go on mute, please? Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to finish in a few minutes and then we'll hopefully have conversation. One of the things that was said at the time of John's death last year was that just before he died, Lila Marymount gave him the President's Award. And John was quoted as saying, "To be looked at not only on one level, my art, but on other levels, not just art, but my work for justice and faith." And as I mentioned this piece of art earlier, he wanted to draw people into the art and his skills, but he wanted us to go to another level of spirit and faith and justice and peace. this picture, this poster I showed earlier, what he did is he took the work of Francis of Assisi and he depicted what he called brother sun, sister moon, sister water, brother wolf, and he tried to depict that in smaller pieces. This is one of his classic pieces called The Peaceable Kingdom. And we've used this before for ICJP events. It is taken from the Hebrew text that the lion will sit with the lamb. And then he has put the child depicted in the Hebrew text holding a candle in the middle. An amazing, intense, if you were to look at this very, very closely, all of those trees have like 10 or 12 colors on them. So they jump out at you when you look at the original serigraphs. So I bring this in the context of our Pope Francis, when we were talking about filling in and getting a speaker for today. I didn't know that Francis and the interfaith leadership would have been gathering last week in Casatan. And at that gathering with interfaith leaders from around the world, this is Francis said this: may we never justify violence. It's as if he came to ICJP, right? It's as if he had listened to George Regas and so many of us around the table. Religions must not bless war. So he brought that message to that interfaith gathering, specifically focused on what's happening. Why I can't. Oh, there we go. So one of the pieces that came up when they were gathering last week to talk about war and peace was a confrontation with the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church. For they continue to bless the Russian peace of the war in Ukraine. And there's an attempt by the interfaith religious community to influence that particular part of the Christian world, so as that might influence the president of Russia. The leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church said he justified Russian invasion on spiritual and ideological ground, calling it a metaphysical battle with the West. He has blessed the Russian soldiers going into war and invoked the idea that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. And we know that this has happened by so many of our religious leaders over the centuries of war, whether it be a Catholic cardinal or an imam or a religious person from faith, sending them off to war. One of my favorite pieces of Mark Twain is his piece on war, in which he mocks the religious person sending him off to war. If you've not read Mark Twain's piece on war, it's savagely beautiful. That talks about the ravages of war. Francis last week said, may we never justify violence, may we never allow the sacred to be exploited by the profane. The sacred must never be the prop for power, nor power a prop for the sacred. Straight out of the words of George Regas and Martin Luther King and so many of our friends and colleagues. One of the gifts of last week, which I wasn't planning when I said yes to this presentation, was Pope Francis made a point that we as a world need to go back to Gandhian school of nonviolence. And how do we bring Gandhian's work and Martin Luther King work into a place of nonviolence in the midst of this terrible conflict? One of the challenges I think for us as peacemakers is how do we practice the Gandhian school, where we use nonviolence as a source of strength and power. So Francis tried to use that in the context of this war. And in the middle of this quote, it says the real solution is not other weapons, other sanctions, other political military alliances, but another approach, a different way, the ICJP way, a way of governing the now global world, not showing the teeth as now one way different than by setting international relationships. The model of treatment is already in place, thank God, but unfortunately, it is still a subject to that of the economic, technocratic military power. So as we have this conversation today, I just invite us to think about those words and the pieces of art of John, of how do you and I individually, and how do we as ICJP bring a nonviolent perspective to a war and a world of war. Francis said this a few years ago, in our complex and violent world, it is truly a formidable undertaking to work for peace by living the practice of nonviolence. Equally daunting is the aim of achieving full disarmament by reaching people's very souls, building bridges, fighting fear and pursuing open and sincere dialogue. These are all what we've been doing as ICJP for decades. This is a quote of Francis. I am deeply convinced that violence can never bring a country peace and well-being because it always and only generates more violence. He's basically saying the same wonderful words of Martin Luther King and so many others. One of the challenges that I bring to our conversation now is that when he was flying back, Pope Francis was asked about the use of weapons in Ukraine. And he made this statement that has gotten some interesting feedback. So the question was whether weapons should be given to Ukraine. And he said this is a political decision which can be morally acceptable if it is done according to the conditions of morality, which are manifold, and then we can talk about it. But it can be immoral if it is done with the intention of provoking more war or selling weapons or discarding those weapons that are no longer needed. The motivation is what largely qualifies the morality of an act. To defend oneself is not only lawful, but also an expression of love, country. Those who do not defend themselves, those who do not defend something, do not love it, instead of those who defend love. And this controversial statement I bring to our conversation today. It's that constant back and forth reality of when a war has happened, and we as peace people would want to bring in nonviolence, what rules of morality govern the world of war? And St. Augustine tried to do this by the just war theory. We know that, as I mentioned earlier, became and was used for many wars, including nuclear weapons that were blessed before they were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I just invite us with this honoring of John August Swanson, a peacemaker, and Pope Francis. This was a picture of last week's interfaith gathering in Kazakhstan. So I just bring those two people, let me get rid of this, into our conversation. How does that evoke from us, the struggle as we watch a country, whether it was El Salvador or Nicaragua or so many other places in the world, and now Ukraine, as we try to be instruments of nonviolence, as we try to live ICJP values, how do we come to terms And Pope Francis was trying to work that through in when the war has started, and however people want to read this, is there, how do we, as religious people, because that's who he was speaking to, how do we say no to war? But how do we look at the answer to that question when people are being murdered and killed, clearly raped and tortured? How do we struggle with that moral use of weapons and sending of weapons? And so I want to put that all before us for our conversation this morning. Swanson, his art about nonviolence and using it as a way to reflect deeply, and Pope Francis as a person of our church, out of our terrible history, but also some of our good history, calling us to be peacemakers, and then trying to deal with the concreteness of weapons of war. So I hope that engenders some conversation amongst us. I'm putting into the chat some resources that I mentioned that some of you might find helpful.
If I may, I don't have my hand up, but I'd like to jump in immediately. If that's
Go ahead.
okay, Rick?
Go ahead.
When my son was little, and let's just say 4 or 5, around there, we lived on a corner, and there were a group of 5 children that always played on the corner there where we lived. And when the boys got a little bit older, they started to fight. And the girls, chimed in and cheered them on and so forth. And one day I was just tired, and I really wanted them to stop. And Carol Francis can probably relate to this, is keeping control in a classroom. And I was watering the plants at the time, and I turned up the water, and I hosed down the kids, and they all ran off to their respective homes. And my son, of course, stayed with me, but was really not happy because I chased off his little friends. And later, as I became more involved in peace activism and in interfaith and so forth, I've thought about that so many times, because here it was just the hose and it was just water, but it was not peaceful. I came, if intention is the key, I did not come from a place of peace. And it was an individual act. And to be honest, I'm not sure to this day that I have a peaceful solution to if I were confronted with the same situation. I'm not sure that I would yet today know how to diffuse it. So I'm throwing that out there for anybody who can help me further this thought. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's something very good to think about. Also, for people on Zoom, there's a reactions tab, and you can raise your hand on there. And of course, after you're done with the question, if you can lower it. And I'll also look for hands up as we go into questions and answers. And bear in mind, I think we only have Father Chris for about 15 minutes. Anthony, did you have a question as well, or was that just
I meant to raise my hand.
Oh, good.
My
Okay.
turn.
Go ahead. Well, please go ahead.
Oh, I think there are other people before me, like Stephen and Vita.
Oh. Let me see.
So while we're looking for, I just would say, when the war started in Ukraine, my gut said, as a peace activist, I needed to go there and put my body in front of the tanks. And I knew I couldn't do that. So I appreciate the question, because it's a gut question for all of us. How do we practice this in this time of war?
Yep. So, yep, now I see everybody's hand up. Stephen, if you have a question.
A couple of things I wanted to say. Thank you so much, Father Chris. I have hanging in my hallway one of Swансon's posters about together we can make a difference. It delights me to see that every day. And I bought another one and I took to my church and put it in the fellowship hall so they could see that. So, and also I think I have another one or two he did for death penalty. Who decides who dies? And it was so inspirational. And I was also impressed by Sister Karita Kent in Immaculate Heart and attended some of her lectures and workshops. That was such a great group. But one of the things that I'm thinking about as we wrestle with this, many of us here in this group have been attending Reverend Lawson's nonviolent workshops. And just to be sure, you know, he will be doing one tomorrow starting at 10 o'clock. And it's still virtual. We're still doing it virtually. But he's so helpful in trying to sort out and talk about Gandhi and going back to Gandhi's school. It's not, these are not easy questions. But I think that we have to deal with them. So thank you so much for bringing it up.
No, it's great. Let's take another question too. Stephen Fisk, if you have something.
Yeah, hi. I don't know that I have a question, although I have lots of questions in life, but a response. I took a vow of nonviolence during the Vietnam War as a follower of Martin Luther King and studying his tactics, strategies for nonviolence in the civil rights movement, and attending meetings at the American Friends Service Committee, who was advising young men who were facing the draft. And I realized that to be nonviolent, we have to make a covenant in our soul and in our heart that violence is not a way to resolve any conflict, because it only exacerbates the situation and manifests more violence and tragedy and sorrow and pain and suffering. But I also realized that in order to make that commitment, I had to make the commitment within myself first, that I must expunge and expel from my own self whatever abuse, whatever violence, whatever tactics of hurt may exist within myself towards other people, that I would have to expel that from myself, and I would have to live it and be it. And so the teachings of Gandhi were very much a part of that process. And in the study of that, I understood that to defend oneself physically, as you did, Lucy, you used water to hose down kids who were fighting. That was a good thing to do. You stopped someone from possibly getting hurt, and you did it in such a way that no one else was hurt. Maybe they got a little frightened because they were sprayed by water by a woman, But that was a brave thing to do. It was a courageous thing to do, because in the philosophy of nonviolence, defense might not be considered a violent act, because it is preventing harm. It is preventing perhaps someone being really hurt or being even killed. If there was someone shooting in a theater or in a public venue, and you were able to stop that person, perhaps even by killing them, then you're saving lives, and you are protecting life. And that is the crux of nonviolence, to save and protect the sacredness of life under all circumstances, even if it means spraying someone with a hose or getting in the way of an act of violence and somehow stopping it. And the issue of war, which is before us, it seems interminably, especially now with the war in Ukraine, we must stop first the war within ourselves, and then we must do all we can as activists to promote the ideas of nonviolence. And so I'm so thankful to you, Father Chris, for once again bringing us to that heart space of nonviolence. And that is the road not taken by humanity. It seems that from the time we emerged from the wilderness, we are subject to the law of violence, which is, to survive by killing, And we as human beings, we have the ability to rise above that. We can survive by love. We can survive by respecting each other and respecting the dignity of all people, and not lowering ourselves to the level of the animal, the fang and the claw and the killing and the devouring of others. That's where we must go. And that's why I come to ICUJP every Friday morning, because here I find that those teachings, that educational process of awakening that you spoke of, Father Chris, that we must awaken, that the Pope spoke of, that Martin Luther King spoke of. That's all I want to say.
That's good. Thank you. We can't hear you, Rick.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for that, Stephen. I want to go through with some other people, because I think we only have Father Chris for about 10 more minutes. Doc Ruby, if you had a question.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. Well, thank you just for being you. You're such a reminder of me. I was at the Catholic Church and been involved with them up until the 70s when I graduated, and Loyola still doesn't release me. But you are the positive energy that needs to be expressed and brought out with the Catholic Church. I do remember John Swanson, and I do remember his sister, Corita, and I think I have some of those pictures. But Father Chris, I'd like to keep in touch with you too regarding some of the different programs that they're having with the, because in going to attending Loyola Marymount, you have to study religion. And that was when I released the Catholic Church, because I realized then everybody was one, truth is truth. But I see, when I hear you and see you, and what you're expressing is knowing why I was involved with the Catholic Church at that time. So even though I'm so-called metaphysical, I just want to thank you again, and I support you in your work.
Great. Thank you.
I would just, if I could, just at the core of what Pax Christi does in our church is we all take a vow of nonviolence, as Stephen mentioned, and I renew it every year on the Feast of St. Francis, because that was my first day when I got arrested at the nuclear test site. And how do I live that in the midst of these bigger multi-trillion-dollar budgets of military weapons and the wars? On the first night of the war in Ukraine, we organized a peace vigil in front of the hospital. And sadly, all the people that wanted it to happen didn't show up. So it was just a few of us chaplains. And one medical person showed up, and she was from Syria. And she stood with us for a few minutes, and she said, how quickly are they going to forget about Ukraine like they forgot about Syria? Those people witnessed to me. We all need to keep working at this. So.
Yep, it's true. I think if I'm going to try and put two people together to ask a question, and then Father Chris, if you can respond. Anthony, if you can ask your question.
Well, first of all, I resonate with everything that everyone has said so far. I was really impressed with what you shared, Father Chris. One thing that I was impressed with was your honesty about the history of violence in the church. Those images you presented were shocking and disturbing, and reminded me of why I became an agnostic when I was about 12 and started reading the history of the church and of European so-called civilization. But what gives me hope is that the church is changing and has come to embrace nonviolence. And at the same time, I also want to say how much I appreciate you for lifting up the real moral dilemma that people face when they are being threatened. I know I was at a wedding party, a Muslim wedding party, and we were talking about the Ukraine, and someone challenged me as a Quaker and said, well, what would you do if you were Ukrainian? And, I had to answer honestly, I don't know what I would do. I am a pacifist, I'm nonviolent, but I can't judge other people. I have to follow their conscience. And what I do know is that I'm very skeptical about the idea of sending weapons to the Ukraine, because history has shown that that isn't a solution that's worked very well. So, I struggle with those moral issues. I'm glad that you brought them up today. I think that, much as I resonate with the fervor of nonviolence as a philosophy of life, it's sometimes very challenging to put into practice. And I appreciate that you raised those issues for us. So thank you.
My next. Thank you so much. I do think that one of the answers to the conundrum we're talking about is the concept of revolutionary nonviolence. I don't know why when I speak this seems to create an echo. I don't know if it's I guess it's my fault. I'll get a little closer to the mic. I think that the eruptions of war that we see are the consequences of ongoing violence that is less visible or less noticeable to some people. And I don't agree entirely with some of the things that Dave Clennon has been putting up on the list, but I do think that there's been violence on the side of NATO and violence within Ukraine. There was war in Ukraine before this war. There was a civil war going on in the eastern Ukraine between the government and Russian-speaking residents. And I think that we have been neglectful of dealing with our responsibility to challenge our own government and society around some of these questions. And We live in a system. I did my reflection this morning about life and death, but I think that we live in a death-dealing system that we need to confront more. We need to challenge people to resist in different ways and to withdraw our consent to the kinds of violence that our society, the violence of poverty, the violence that you showed in the of denial of human rights. And I think that that's very challenging and very difficult. And, very few of us are war tax resistors the way that Joe Maislish was here. And so we all have, some skin in the game that we need to think about and try to, engage with a sense of what would a nonviolent world really look like. It would not have borders, would not have colonialism, would not have, governments probably even. So anyway, just some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Just to let everybody know too, next week we're going to have a talk with John Quigley, who's a writer for The Nation and a few other publications about the war in Ukraine and how it's being reported in the media as well. And I think we got time for maybe we've got 3 hands up and 1 minute. So so Sophia,
The conversation is the group. I don't, so
yeah, that's fine.
I want to acknowledge Lenore Dowling is with us. And if you look at her picture on her wall, is another Karita Kent piece, I think, on the side there.
That's great.
And as I walk away, and I'm really sorry about this, one of the most amazing places I've ever visited in the world was in Manila. There's a wonderful museum and gathering place where they revolutionarily, as a revolution of peace, their community of 1 million people took over the streets without any weapons, and they ended the government of very violence. And we have wonderful models of how we can do this, but in the moment it's difficult, and it means that we all need to be together on it, and that's why the practice of it, as Jim Lawson would say, and what we do on Friday morning, it's the practicing of it, living it out, struggling with it, that then when someone comes in and wants to be violent, we have the strength to be able to resist that. So anyway, good luck with the conversation. I will try to get back if I can.